So before we examine our template or start writing any code, one thing I like to do is just add the type of struct folder under Lambda function names. If we open back our properties for our Lambda function, we'll see that there is a handler and it says handler.handler. What this means is the handler on the left is the actual name of the file, and the name on the right is the name of the actual function in the code. This you can leave as default. I like to clean this up a bit, and let's just see what this looks like in practice. So if we look back at our generated code, you see that the name of the actual file is under that py, which is the left side, and the actual function is under. We also have source/function. We can probably make this a lot more clear as we add more functions. So let's go ahead and make just a minor change. I'm gonna rename this to source that the name of the actual function. So let's call this create URL, and that way for all our functions they'll have a matching name in the directory. Also for handler, we can actually say create URL and handler, or we can say lambda.handler. I'll leave handler for now since that works, and let's just save this. And if that works as expected, that should update the directory structure. So we should have a source and a create URL with the handler and handler. And this we can probably throw this away, but let's keep that for now. So this didn't go exactly as planned. We need to probably manually change this. Let's look again on our template. We said it should be create URL.handler. However, this is still the same handler. So let me go ahead and just call this create URL. And that should work. So now that we have a decent folder structure, we can probably start taking a look at their template.yml file and go a little bit further. So let's actually get rid of the function folder since this no longer maps to anything. We're just going to take it off, and let's open up our template.yml file. So we'll see at the top right, we have a serverless function. And it's good that we didn't have to write this from scratch. This is a good way to learn if you're just starting off. And as you start get more comfortable, you can write this out some more. And type is serverless function. There's some common components like description, name. Code URI is actually where the code is, and that's source, that name of the function file. And handler again matches what we actually type in the properties in the application composer. Runtime, we already know this should match whatever version you choose. And these are some default properties of a Lambda function, right? If based on how much requests or demand that Lambda function needs, we can actually up these properties. Timeout, I'll usually leave that as default. And the architecture could be x86 or ARM64, which is a lot cheaper to use. Event, and this is how the API maps to the URL. So we have a path for create URL. This is a post method, and this is a reference to the actual API service. So whenever you see a ref, we're just calling the ID of the actual resource. There are also some environment variables, and again, application composer gives us all this. This is the name of the table. We'll need this in our code as when we try to save data. And this is the ARN, stands for Amazon Resource Name, which is basically a unique identifier every AWS resource is assigned. There's also some policies, right? In order for Lambda to actually access DynamoDB, it needs permission. And this is the actual policy that will be attached to the default role that the Lambda function has. So by default, right, you may not see a role created in the template, but when we create this in your AWS console, there'll be a default Lambda execution role. Later on in the course, we could probably write your own role, but this is a good way just to start off. and these policies will be attached to the role. We have a log, and that's for CloudWatch log, right? So another way we can kind of see what their function is doing. And this is the actual API. Again, this may be a little confusing. I find the HTTP API to be a lot more simpler, so we'll change this later on. One of the key we just need to look at now is the paths, right? We need a slash create URL. It's a type a post, and it proxies to the actual Lambda function. So we won't go too much into detail with that for now, since we'll change it later on. And this is our DynamoDB table. So it's a type Dynamo table, and again we set their ID of type string. The billing mode, there's a few different billing mode, and we can check the docs on this, but pay per request, just saying that the table will scale based on demand. We can actually make this a lot more specific if we want, but this is a good way to start off. Again, that's all we need to get started. If we actually build our project, we should be able to see if there's any errors. So I'm just going to issue a SAM build. This may take a minute or two. Just make sure you're actually in the directory of the code. So let me save cd into the actual function code folder. Clear this, and we're going to do a SAM build. And that compiled our project. We can also test this locally before we deploy to the cloud. So let's take a quick look at how we can do that. We can issue a SAM local invoke. And as we have more functions, right, we'll need to specify the name of the function. But since we only have one function to test, so if we do a SAM local invoke, and this will just trigger our Lambda function. Let's take a look at the actual code. We just need to print. So there's no event, but let's see the output. And again, initially in our course, we set up Docker and a few other things that you need to actually do this. So again, it's printing a blank template. So let's just print our own data. So let's just say print first deploy Lambda. We're going to save this. Again, you need to do a SAM build. And let's clear this. And we'll do a SAM invoke, and this should print your message. And if we check, we should see the output of our Lambda function. All right, so that's all cool. Another thing we can actually do is we can test our API locally as well. And one of the best way to do that is, let's clear this. SAM build. So let's make just a minor modification to our function, so we can just send back a HTTP request when we actually test this. So let's go ahead and just change this up a bit. We want the event, of course, the request we sent in. What we want to return is some data in this, and we just say status code. So we have 200. And for the body, we just do a JSON dump on the event. Let's save this and let's do another SAM build. So there is one other option. It's not displayed here, but we can do a SAM invoke API just to start up our API. So let's do a SAM local start API. And this allows us to actually test our API locally. And so here we get in the request is running on this port. If you have something else running on 3000, you may have to kill that just for testing. And this, we can open this up in pretty much any tool for API testing. I'm using Postman, so I'm just going to drag Postman over here. And remember, this is a post, so let's go ahead and just change this. And in the body, I'm just going to put a raw JSON. So let's just do and just say URL system.com, and just do maybe some other data. Just say new URL for testing, and we're going to send this request. We're getting a missing authentication, so let's go ahead and change one thing right here. So this is the base URL, so we need to pass in the actual path, and this is a create URL. So let's send that request, and we got an error. So if we go back, let's see what's actually the error message. If we go back to our Visual Studio Code, let's see if we're able to actually see. So there is a 502, and there's an error on line 8. Okay, so this should be dumps. Let's save this, and I'm just gonna do a some build again. So what I did is just open a new tab so we don't have to kill our API. So let me cd into URL. I'm just gonna clear this, and let's do another some build. So that should pick up our change. Let's send this up in Postman again. So I'm gonna send the same request, and let's see if we have any luck. And there we go. So let's see. Well, it's not as clean as I wanted it. And here it is, it returning the actual event, which is the data that we sent. So let's do a raw. Okay, so that's pretty. And we should see some additional data in our terminal too. So we have a 200. And that's all the event itself. So this is a little messy, but it is a quick way to test your our data, to test your function locally before we deploy it. It doesn't work for every scenario, but it does help your development flow, and you can move a lot faster by just testing it before we deploy. So in our next video, we'll start building out this code, and we'll also deploy to AWS so we can test from there from a more realistic point of view.